We're going to talk about insulin today. Okay, so insulin, well, the only name I've got for you is insulin. And we're going to talk a little bit about stimulus secreted from target response class, and we're going to include some disorders. So, what is the stimulus? What causes the secretion of insulin? High blood sugar, also known as hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia is just a word that means too much sugar in the blood. Hyper is high, glyce is talking about sugar, emia is referring to the blood. Now, normally this occurs after a meal, okay? And your body undergoes homeostasis to help maintain blood sugar levels, which, by the way, your brain is one of the organs that requires glucose. And you need about 120 grams per day for glucose for the brain. Normal blood glucose levels, in case you were interested, is about 70 to 120 milligrams of sugar per deciliter of blood. So anything higher than 120 is termed hyperglycemia, and a chronic condition of hyperglycemia can lead to eye disease, nerve disease, kidney disease, and you sum all those up together and you get diabetes mellitus, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit later. Now, anything less than 70 is referred to as hypoglycemia, and things that would occur would be tired, coma, death. So not good when the sugar levels are out of the normal range and cannot be controlled by your normal hormones. So when sugar's too high, insulin is what's going to come in and try to get that back down to homeostasis. Now, where is insulin secreted from? So here we've got to look at the pancreas, okay, this organ right here, the pancreas. And now we know the pancreas is an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. So today we're talking about it in terms of its endocrine function. So yes, while it does secrete digestive enzymes into the small intestine, that's the exocrine function. So we're going to be looking at the endocrine portion, which is the islets of Langerhans. So if you take one of these islets of Langerhans and kind of blow it up, you get this picture over here. And within that, you have many hormone secreting cells. You've got the alpha cells, which secrete the hormone glucagon. You've got delta cells, which secrete the hormone somatostatin. And you've got beta cells, which secrete the hormone insulin. So it's the beta cells within the islets of Langerhans within the pancreas that we're going to be referring to as far as insulin producing cells. Again, this islet of Langerhans is infiltrated with blood vessels. So that way, those hormones, remember, go directly into the bloodstream. Now, where does it go? What is the target cell? What is the response of the presence of insulin? Now, I know we normally associate insulin with it lowers blood sugar. But not only that, it does so much more. So there's so much extra that's going on behind the scenes as well. So it's basically any process that's going to result in a lowering of blood sugar. So the purpose of insulin, again, is to take the sugar out of the blood and store it. So it's really storing excess energy is what it's doing. Now, when we're talking about energy, this could be any of these energy producing macromolecules, such as we're storing fats and lipids, we're storing carbohydrates, which is the glucose, the one you're most familiar with, and we're also storing protein. So we're storing all of this because we're trying to keep glucose levels down, and any of these energy producing molecules are going to result in an increase in glucose. So we've got to get all of this stuff out of the bloodstream. And when you've just eaten, all of these things are very prevalent in the bloodstream. You've got an excess of amino acids, you've got an excess of sugar, you've got an excess of fat floating in the bloodstream, which all can lead to the production of glucose. So if you're trying to bring blood glucose down, you got to get rid of all that stuff. So again, it's really regulating the storage of glucose. When you store glucose, by default, you're lowering blood glucose levels. Now, taking glucose, the form that we're going to be storing it in is glycogen. So going from glucose in the blood to storage of that is going to be glycogen. Uh, glycogen glycogenesis is the process of glucose to glycogen, which is the storage form. So we're going to talk more about how insulin actually works at the cell, the target cell, but what is it really doing? So your cells have the ability to take up glucose, but not unless insulin is present. So when insulin shows up, it's like a lock and key mechanism here with your cell. It's going to go in and lock, and then that's going to open. Whoops, sorry, it said it right there. It's going to open that glucose channel to allow glucose to come in. So without the insulin, glucose will not enter the cells. So what cells are able to take up insulin? Are able to bind with insulin and take up sugar. So we've got a couple of things going on. So again, this is primarily going to occur in a fed state situation, which is mean you've just eaten. Skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is going to take up glucose, and insulin is going to promote the uptake of that glucose. It is going to synthesize glycogen. So we're going to take that glucose and we're going to make glycogen out of it and store it. That's called glycogenesis. It's also going to promote protein synthesis. Wow, why would it do that? The building blocks of proteins are amino acids. And believe it or not, we're going to say in a minute, your liver has the ability to take those amino acids and turn it into, guess what? Sugar, which we don't want. We're trying to store it. We're not trying to make sugar, so we're trying to store sugar. So we've got to get all the building blocks out of the way as well that have the potential to make sugar, amino acids being one of them. So how do we get rid of amino acids? Well, let's make a protein out of it. So protein synthesis is going to go up. In fat cells, yes, we're going to promote glucose uptake. Lipogenesis, the synthesis of fat. So we're going to make fat. Why? Because again, the building blocks of fat can be by the liver turned into sugar, turned into glucose. We can take fat and turn it into sugar. Get rid of the building blocks and you cannot make sugar. So we're going to promote the synthesis of fats, which means we're going to inhibit the breakdown of fat, right? We're not trying to put more building blocks in the blood. So we're just going to put lipolysis on the back burner. We don't want to break fat down and bank those building blocks. We want to take the building blocks and store fat, which is in the form of triglycerides. Now, the liver, what is it doing? Again, we really got to tell the liver what to do because the liver has the building blocks to do just about whatever it wants. So we're going to inhibit gluconeogenesis. Now, this is what I've kind of been leading up to. Gluconeogenesis is the conversion of glycogen to glucose. So again, we don't want glycogen, the storage form, into a bunch of little glucose molecules. So we're going to inhibit that. We're going to promote glycogen synthesis. So we don't want glycogen being broken down at the same time we're trying to build it. So we're going to prevent one and increase the other. And of course, we're going to promote lipogenesis, the synthesis of fat. So yeah, your liver can do that too. Your liver is an amazing little thing. This is a very confusing picture. And while we're not going to talk about each one of these, I did want to show you mainly how big of an impact insulin has on so many different processes. Bottom line is, if we split the graph in half, bottom line is we're going to do everything we can on this side to take the glucose and turn it into something else. For instance, we're going to take it and turn it into glycogen, glycogenesis. We're going to convert the glucose and run it through glycolysis and Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, turn it into some energy. We're going to take those amino acids and promote protein synthesis out of that. Now, everything on the other side of the chart, we're going to prevent from happening because all of these processes result in increased glucose in the blood. So in other words, if you take gluconeogenesis, this is taking these molecules and turning it into, guess what? Glucose. Well, we're trying to get rid of glucose. So we certainly don't want processes in the liver making more glucose while we're trying to get rid of it and trying to store it. So all of these processes on this side end up resulting in forming glucose in some form or fashion, or providing the building blocks, such as lipolysis, which is providing the building blocks for glucose production. Again, providing the building blocks for glucose production. So we're going to stop, insulin is going to stop anything that will lead to glucose or anything that will lead to the building blocks that will make glucose. Insulin is going to promote any process that is going to pull glucose away and turn it into something else. That something else could be glycogen, that something else could be ATP, that something else could be protein, that something else could be fat. So what is kind of the process here that goes along? So kind of looking at it, the big picture here. The intestines are going to have the macromolecules that have been broken down into their building blocks, the glucose, the amino acids, the fatty molecules. All this is going to be found in the intestines. These substances are going to enter the bloodstream. Sure, fats are going to enter the lymphatic system first, but even still, we still have to deal with them. So the pancreas is going to secrete insulin because of the presence of glucose and all these other building blocks. The liver is going to take the glucose from the blood. It's going to promote the creation of glycogen, which is the storage form. It's going to promote the conversion of glucose to triglycerides, which is lipolysis, right? Or lipogenesis. I'm sorry. We're going to make fat and then go store it in the adipose tissue. And it's going to promote amino acids being pulled from the blood and leading to protein synthesis. So again, we're taking all the building blocks and turning them into something so we don't have glucose. Now, the lymphatic system, insulin is also going to cause the synthesis of triglycerides at the adipose tissue. The liver, yes, is going to do its own job of making triglycerides, but the adipose tissue will do it as well. Now, what kind of class is insulin? It's a peptide hormone. Now, keep in mind, peptide hormones are water soluble. Meaning they dissolve very well in the blood. However, they don't enter the target cells, right? They can't because of that phospholipid bilayer. We talked about that way back in chapter, 17, I believe, in the textbook. So just trying to remind you guys what happened. And I showed you this picture back in chapter 17. So remember, water-soluble hormones act on receptors on the cell surface. So this is just general, but insulin would be this water-soluble hormone floating in the blood, and it's going to bind to a receptor on the cell surface. That receptor on the cell surface for insulin specifically is going to generate more glucose protein channels to allow glucose to come into the cell. So while insulin binds to the outside surface of the target cells, it causes this chain reaction of events inside the cell. And for insulin specifically, it creates more glucose channels. So again, just kind of FYI on this one, because we're not talking about steroids, but remember, steroid hormones have the ability to go all the way inside the cell and affect the nucleus directly. This is not insulin. Okay, so some diseases, and that's the reason why I talked to you about that, is because this leads into the diseases that we have here. So the diseases, the main one is diabetes mellitus, which is basically sugar diabetes, and there are two types. You've got type 1 and type 2. So with this is the normal situation here in this top picture. The pancreas, which is what this yellow thing is here, secretes the insulin. The insulin binds to the receptors on the cell, opening the channel, allowing glucose to come in. That's what's supposed to happen. Because remember, we said with a water-soluble protein, water-soluble hormone, that has to stay attached on the outside surface. The insulin's not allowed to come into the cell because it's water-soluble. Now, in type 1 diabetes, we have a situation where the pancreas fails to produce insulin. So it's not that the cells don't respond, it's that there's no insulin there for them to respond to. So glucose can't enter the cell, which leads to high blood sugar. Now, in type 2 diabetes, it's not that the pancreas isn't producing insulin, it is. The problem is the cells fail to respond to the insulin. So they're not recognizing the insulin. So therefore, the glucose still can't get into the cell. So you're still leading, your result is still the same. You still have high blood sugar. but for two very different reasons. So again, diabetes mellitus is more commonly referred to as just diabetes. So in the subsequent slides, we're just going to call it diabetes. Now, remember, we talked about diabetes insipidus, which is associated with antidiuretic hormones. So diabetes is increased volume of urine. This happens to be sweet because of the glucose present. So type 1 diabetes, this is also called insulin dependent. Now, this happens usually in kids have this. There's usually some kind of autoimmune situation, a virus that attacks the pancreas beta cells, something that's going on that causes the pancreas to be damaged, and it will no longer make insulin. Now, type 2 diabetes is also called non-insulin dependent or adult onset diabetes. So it's not that the pancreas isn't making insulin, because it is. It's that your target cells are no longer receptive to that insulin. About 90% of the people with diabetes have this. Now, that's just kind of for your information. Not really going to test you on that. So when you have type 2 diabetes, your pancreas does secrete insulin, but it's either not enough or your pancreas or your body cells aren't responding to it. So usually what happens is you have this buildup of insulin resistance. Again, your cells are not responding to the insulin. So just kind of showing you a little bit about that. You've got your healthy cell here, which you can see is responding. That insulin receptor is binding to that insulin, and then glucose is freely allowed to come into the cell when the insulin is present. However, with type 2 diabetes, the insulin receptor is still there. The insulin is present, but it's not connecting with that insulin receptor for whatever reason. So the glucose stays in the blood and does not enter the cells. So people who are obese tend to have more of a risk factor for uh, getting type 2 diabetes. So does that mean people who are obese, if they lose weight, they will not have type 2 diabetes anymore? That is true. You can reverse type 2 diabetes. You can't reverse type 1. If there's something creating a problem with the pancreas working, it's not going to start working for any reason. So it's kind of a dead organ as far as insulin production goes. Type 2 diabetes, however, the pancreas is still working. So people who are obese, if they lose the weight, they could become no longer insulin resistant, and the pancreas will work pretty well. Okay, so that is it for insulin.